wanna know something I learned while writing the script for this episode? It is really hard to review good comedy. I mean, when I decided that I would review an episode of Dan vs., I thought I could just look at it and say, it was a good show, at least it got 3 seasons, but no. Looking back at this episode, it showed me that this show was goddamn hilarious, and it is a crime that it only got 3 seasons. And going back to the hard to review good comedy bit, I probably will try to avoid to spoil a lot of the good jokes. I may show some here or there, but yeah. Anyways, let's take a look at the episode Dan vs. Dan. Anyways, let's begin. It starts with Dan in a courtroom, since it turns out that he drove into a church. But he has a perfectly good reason to why he did it.
It wasn't my fault. There was a nun crossing the street against the light. I was gonna run her over.
And you were swerving to avoid her?
Yes.
He gets sentenced to community service, but he doesn't take it, so he has to reappear in court on a later date. Outside of the courthouse, many people recognize Dan, thanking him for several good deeds, to Dan's confusion. Though when Dan comes home, he comes across.
Oh, gotta go, Jerp. Well, this is embarrassing. I figured you'd be at court at least another hour.
Who are you? I am a shadow, the true self.
And because of that joke I just made, I ended up making this dumb bullshit in Photoshop. I have no idea why I did, but I decided to waste an hour of my life and make this. This is just how my mind works sometimes. And well, I have to say this, I am really appreciating a mistaken identity plot that actually involves people who look alike. So yeah, Hub 1, Nickelodeon Cartoon Network 0. Wait, the hub no longer exists. Still, 1 point hub. So Dan tells Chris about the imposter, so let's see if Chris believes him.
Hello?
Elise, you know the thing we always thought would happen? Well, it's happening. Dan has snapped.
Wait, how has Dan snapped? Clock Tower?
No.
Wait, stop. A cartoon that aired on the same channel as My Little Pony just made a reference to the UT Clock Tower shooting. I mean, sure, Dan vs. had dark humor, but still, what the fuck? Though, I guess if Seinfeld can get away with referencing the JFK assassination, I guess anything goes.
That is one magic loogie.
Alternate personality.
Huh, I wouldn't bet the other way.
Didn't we have a contingency plan for this?
Sure, you isolate him, I'll call the shrink my company uses to reprogram enemy field agents.
Wait, they use him for what?
What? You dropped out for a second there. I'll see you in 15.
Sounds good, gotta go.
So Dan and Chris go out and run into more people who mistaken Dan for Dan. Then Elise seduces Dan. She and Chris take him to a psychiatrist. It doesn't go well.
Stop it! No! What is wrong in your brain? Hey, pal, if you didn't want to know about my childhood, you shouldn't have asked!
They bring Dan home and finally see the imposter for themselves.
Why would anyone want to be Dan?
I'm so glad you asked that, Elise. And by the way, you don't look anything like the unflattering drawings Dan has of you in his journal.
You've been reading my journal?
What does he mean, unflattering?
Elise, honey, you're a cartoon character. I can find more unflattering pictures of you by spending 30 seconds in Google Images, so don't be too harsh on Dan.
You ask, why Dan? Well, most people have a network of friends and family who know and love them, making it near impossible to steal their identities. But Dan here is off-putting and angry.
Off-putting? Angry?
That's just the tip of the iceberg. Tell me, what do you have to show for your lifetime of apathy and petty vengeance?
Well, I have a foosball table, so I got that going for me.
You don't even like foosball.
He's right. I'm an air hockey man.
You have alienated everyone in your life except for Chris and Elise, and I have a feeling at least one of them is gettable.
Attack!
Let's hear him out. What exactly do you want?
Oh, I've already got it. A place to live, a television, a kitty who loves me, and friends all over the neighborhood. Friends who know me as Dan, the neighbor who cares. Dan, the neighbor who lives in apartment 8. So, if you don't leave immediately, I'll be forced to shoot you in self-defense. Good day.
That last part sounded a little like you.
So Dan and Chris attempt some sort of scheme, but...
I assume that's Dan in the box there?
He's onto us! Quick! Smother him with your big meaty hands!
And Chris ends up abandoning Dan over Pie. Because of this, Dan tries to get revenge on Chris by taking his identity. It doesn't go well. Then Dan tries something else.
That disguise doesn't fool me. I know who you are.
It's not a disguise. It's my new identity. I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. I've spent my life alienating and avoiding people. I've decided to follow your example and get a fresh start.
Really?
Dan's all yours. You can call me Biff. Biff Wellington.
I don't know what to say.
Say this. Say, we'll be friends.
Then after a barbecue, Dan gives Dan the rights to Dan, but then the cops show up to arrest Dan since Dan didn't show up in court. The cops mistaken Dan for Dan. Dan says that he isn't Dan, but they see that Dan is Dan. Dan swears revenge on Dan, and Dan is glad that he's Dan again. And then Dan gives us some words to live by.
Why should I change? I'm great. It's everyone else who sucks.
So that was Dan vs. Dan, and it's a really good example on why Dan vs. was a really good series. I mean, it had plenty of great lines with its small bits of dark humor that sprinkled throughout it here and there. And I know what some of you might be thinking on how I complained about the dark humor in my review of The Laziest. Well, here's the thing. There, the dark humor involves the pain of a completely innocent person. Here, sure, the imposter Dan ends up getting arrested for Dan's crimes, but here's the thing. He deserved it. So, if you want a show that actually does dark humor well, and if you haven't seen the show, check it out. Though, if you're like me, you may end up feeling slightly saddened by the fact that it was cancelled after 3 seasons. And while it is gone, I do feel that some of its spirit lives on through Rick and Morty. While I'm pretty sure none of the same staff has worked on both shows, and it's probably not intentional whatsoever, but, you know, both shows do revolve around some complete asshole who you somehow end up liking, forcing some sort of pushover into helping him with his schemes. I don't know, I guess I can't help but see some similarities.
Take off those clothes.